with the Stanford University Press and is getting exceptionally positive reviews. And, so now I feel compelled to read it. We need to thank Dr. Johnny Beck-Arney to make this possible. Normally, our format is we have 40 minutes presentation followed by 20 minutes Q&A session, but I think that they will change our format a little bit. We'll stay within the 60 minutes frame, but I think Dr. Arinova wants to say a few words to open up. Then the floor will go to Dr. Kassenova, and then we'll keep the remaining 15-20 minutes for Q&A. So if there's any lingering question that we have, we can ask you to elaborate further. Johnny Beck, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Ricardo. It's very kind of you. I don't have anything to say, and I just want to thank Dr. Kassenova for agreeing to present this beautiful book. So it's a kind of, our pleasure having you here. So yeah, you can start, I guess. It's just.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Evening Kazakhstan time. It's morning in Washington, D.C. I'm joining you from the United States. Speaking to the audiences in Kazakhstan is especially meaningful for me, and so I was really looking forward to it, and I'm really happy to be with everyone today. So let me start sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see well and hear me. So the book that I've been working on for almost 15 years, actually. So it was a very long time in the making, and I'm actually glad I took all this time because the book evolved, and what I wanted to tell in this book and how I wanted to tell it changed quite a bit. My training is international relations, and initially I was planning to do a very academic IR book that would test different models, checking Kazakhstan's case against all those models and focusing purely on decision making. Why did Kazakhstan give up its nuclear inheritance? But as I worked in the archives, as I started traveling to the region, I understood that the story of decision making post-Soviet collapse is only half of the story, that it would be difficult to tell it without explaining about what happened in the past during the Soviet period of Kazakhstan. But more importantly, I just understood in a very profound way that for me, even more important than politics or diplomacy, it was the people of Kazakhstan that I cared the most, that I really wanted to share the story of the price that Kazakhstan paid for the Soviet nuclear program. And it became less of an academic pursuit and more a mission, I guess, of me as a Kazakh, as somebody who was born there to bring the story. And so the book ended up covering a long period of time, starting from the late 1940s and up to today. And of course, my main motivation was because nuclear story is such an important part of Kazakhstan's nation building. But I think even us within Kazakhstan, we don't know it very well. We don't understand it very well. And I don't think we dealt with the collective trauma also. And we didn't have enough self-reflection on this part of our history. So let's start from the period of nuclear tests. If you read the documents from the Soviet period of when the Soviet military was deciding where to test nuclear weapons, and they were rushing to do it because the United States was the first to drop nuclear bombs on Japan, and they had several options, and they chose the Semipolitics region because of geography and geology, logistics. It worked well for them because there was access to construction materials such as sand and water. it had access to transportation hubs, but it wasn't too close to them because the main concern was about foreign intelligence. But what struck me, as somebody who is coming from Kazakhstan, was the description of the area as completely uninhabited. And of course, I don't have to explain to this audience that that was completely untrue. Not only there were rural settlements and pastures right in the middle of the area that would be later taken for the polygon use, but the fact that the city of Semipolitics, which at the time had already more than 150,000 residents, was only a bit more than 100 kilometers away. That completely didn't enter into calculation. I think partly because at that time, they probably didn't understand themselves fully the impact of radiation. But nonetheless, even if this knowledge about the harmful, about the detailed, even if there was no detailed knowledge in the very beginning about the harmful impact of ionizing radiation on humans, if it wasn't available in the beginning, it started manifesting in real life on the ground very, very soon after the test started. I would say by early 50s, it was already pretty clear that people started getting sick and that there was harm done to the environment and to the population's health. There was very little thought given to the local population. Everything was kept in secret. The narrative was completely controlled by the central government and by the military. And I want to give you a very specific example, which I think shows very well how the local population was more as an afterthought. It wasn't the main part of the calculation. And that example comes from the early 50s. It was when the scientists and the military were ready to test their first thermonuclear device. And I'll just briefly explain the difference. Thermonuclear means that the impact would be many times more powerful than just a nuclear device. And so they already brought the bomb to the polygon, and they were about to test it when somebody from the Ministry of Media Machine Making, that's the disguised name for the ministry that controlled the Soviet nuclear industry, that person asked, but the impact will be so much more powerful. Did we think about the fallout? And even Andrei Sakharov, the developer of the device, admits in his memoirs that no, he describes that we were rushing so much, we didn't think about it until this last minute. And of course, other higher ups from the military, they were upset with that guy that, why did he have to say it? And now we have to think about it. And they had two options. They could delay the test and think about a different way of testing it in a way, maybe at a higher altitude, so that there is less of a negative impact on the ground. But for that, they would have to delay the test, or they could evacuate the people. And they chose not to delay the test and to evacuate the people. And here, I just want to give a feeling of how that would translate on the ground. So imagine you are, living in your village settlement, and then one day suddenly military appears and they tell you that we're gonna evacuate you, we're gonna take you, all your livestock. So it's not only the people, every family had also lots of livestock to take care of. We're going to evacuate you. We're not going to tell you why. We're not going to tell you if you're coming back and when you're coming back. And I was reading the description from a local, low-level official who because the orders would come from above, but then it's the local officials who also had to implement it. And he describes, he said, there was panic in the steppe because people were just panicking. Where are we going? Will we be able to come back? Our dead family members are buried here. So that was the kind of emotion that was there, because they truly didn't know whether they would be back. And so these people, many people were moved, not all. So it was also pretty selective, and I think often not very well thought through or calculated. They were moved. And then many years later, I was watching an interview with one former employee, actually high-level employee of the facility in Semipolitics that monitored the impact of radiation on people. And many years later, he would say, actually, we cannot even say with certainty whether that evacuation worked, whether we evacuated people to a safe place, because we're not sure whether the fallout actually went there. But nonetheless, they returned them in a couple of weeks when the radiation was still there. It was contaminated. And again, I want to give you a glimpse of what people would experience. They would come back, and some of the pets, the dogs, the cats, some were dead. Some would have some of their fur burnt, and obviously all the wells would be contaminated, and so on. And that was not a glitch. That was a pattern. I think I always try to be nuanced, and I actually take an issue with, with the discourse that, oh, the Soviets deliberately wanted to kill the Kazakhs. I think, we really should be, especially as scholars, we should be careful and not use phrases like that. I would say it's not that it was their goal to kill local people or to harm them, but they definitely treated it as collateral damage. That was not, the well-being of the people wasn't their priority. Their priority was national security and advancing nuclear program. On the slide, if you look on the black and white photo, you might think that it's a child, but actually this girl is, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, at that point she was around 16, so her growth stopped. On the other photo, you see one of the victims of nuclear tests from the area. His name was Berik. You can see that he also had severe physical disability. He passed away recently, but basically his entire life, he couldn't have a full life, and his mom had to take care of him. And there are so many stories like that. And I just want to give you a minute to read some of the testimonies told in first person. And you would note that they mentioned suicide. And I think that was really one of the untold tragedies of that period. And I should say that even now in that area, suicides continue, but not at such a high level. And of course, in Kazakhstan in general, we have a problem now with suicides. But during the period of testing, there were so many people committing suicides. And in one of the villages in Semipolitics region, I spoke with a high school teacher who is monitoring statistics for people of his village, and he's trying for the stories of people who passed away not to be forgotten. And so he has his own, records, and he was describing how in the beginning, in Islam, similar with other religions, it's considered to be a sin to commit a suicide. And he described that in the beginning, they buried people who committed, Kazakhs who committed suicide separately, not at the main cemetery. But then he said there were so many of them, we just couldn't, we just decided to bury them at the regular cemetery, and we started calling it the disease of the polygon. Again, that's the sentiment, and there are so many testimonies like that, and it's truly heartbreaking. The doctors, the local doctors, were instructed not to record cancers and not to record that people were getting sick from the impact of radiation. And so what were the narratives back at the time? And for my book, it's really hard. First of all, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a specialist on radiation, and so I can only present what I'm reading, what I'm finding in the archives, and what I was seeing is a very clear case of clashing narratives. You had the Soviet medical establishments associated with the military admitting in their secret internal reports that there is higher level of radiation. They would give data. They would say, okay, in that village, butter was so many times, the radioactivity of butter was so many times above the standard, or they would say in Semipolitics, in one of the stock houses, the level of radioactivity of grain was that many times higher than the norm. But they would never admit this to the local authorities of Semipolitics or to the level at to the republic level. So what was presented by these institutions to, for more public consumption was that, oh, these people are sick because they live in atrocious conditions, they have poor diet, they lack vitamins, poor hygiene, and of course it's a fact that the conditions in rural areas were very difficult, but there was such a difference between, similarly rural areas but far away from the polygon and people who lived right around the polygon. There was a very interesting attempt by the Kazakh Academy of Sciences from the Institute of Regional Pathology under the leadership of Dr. Achabarov. That was for 3 years in the late 50s, a Kazakh expedition, medical expedition that collected data. And it's such also interesting story of both courage, how they did it and recorded it, knowing that they could pay a very high price for that, but also about how that information was completely suppressed. Basically, those doctors, they were summoned to Moscow, and there the more military affiliated medical professionals were questioning their methodology, saying, no, you're all wrong, and your people are sick because of poor diet and severe lack of vitamins. If anyone is interested, we can discuss it during Q&A. But during the Soviet times, I'm often asked, were there any attempts from prominent Kazakh people to raise this issue? And with the disclaimer that I think there are many things we still do not know, and I definitely feel that not everything is available in archives. For example, the period of the 70s is non-existent on this issue. But from what is available right now, there were at least a few attempts to raise this issue. Mukhtar Oeza, for example, a famous writer who himself was a native of Semipolitics region, he brought the issue up at an anti-nuclear conference in Japan. There was an attempt by a Semipolitics regional governor, Suzhikov, in 1958. He also raised it. He was fired within a year. And there is a thought that that the central government wasn't pleased with him because of that, and that's why he lost his job. There was another regional governor who also raised this issue, both with the authorities at the republic level, but also with the central government. But all these attempts unfortunately failed, and I think, unfortunately, but also logically, because you can imagine it's the Soviet period and no freedom. But then, of course, the situation, the context started changing from about mid-80s, and the changes were happening at several levels. At the level of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev comes to power, more reform-oriented, not very interested in pursuing arms race with the United States, himself pretty on board that nuclear testing wasn't necessary anymore. But Gorbachev was at the same time not strong enough to fight the Soviet military. But in any case, the fact that there was perestroika and glasnost meant that there was now more space for expression. More like in more practical terms, how it helped. Under Gorbachev, there was a reform that the Communist Party lost its monopoly, and other parties and movements were allowed, including on environmental issues. And that gave also, a window for the future anti-nuclear movement in Kazakhstan. So that is happening at the Soviet level. At the level of Kazakhstan, you see this as a period of reawakening of national identity. There is more emphasis on Kazakh culture, some of the important poems or pieces of art, and there is this comeback, there is this growing sense of identity. And then, in a perfect storm of events, there is a regular underground nuclear test at Semipolitics, and the information about radioactive venting of radioactive gases becomes public. And it becomes public because, again, this is not the Soviet Union of the 70s or 60s or 50s. This is the Soviet Union of late 80s. And so the information becomes public, and this is when it's picked up both by the local governor in Semipolitics, but also by the Kazakh writer Olja Suleimanov, who was also a deputy at the Soviet Supreme, Верховный Совет. And it's a really heartwarming story as well, and I think it's a bit of a case when there were obvious political components and some things maybe were predetermined, but there was also spontaneity. And for example, when I interviewed Suleimanov, he said when he called for that first rally at the House of Writers in Almaty, and you see people who could fit inside, there were many people waiting outside. He said that morning, I actually didn't have yet an idea of a formal anti-nuclear movement. So they wanted to do the rally, they wanted to express their opposition to nuclear tests, but they didn't yet come up with an idea of a public anti-nuclear movement. But then, the emotions were so raw at that meeting. They had doctors from the Semipolitics region finally being able to speak up about the experiences and victims. And so on the spot, they decide to form a movement. And I think something that many people don't know is actually initially they called it Nevada. There was not even a word Semipolitinsk in the title. So they called it Nevada because from the very beginning, that was seen as a global fight for against all nuclear tests. And they also wanted to feel connected with peace activists in the United States, but then they added Semipolitinsk. And you can see that the logo they created, it depicts the a leader of a native tribe in the United States, because there were many native communities who suffered from US nuclear tests, and you see a Kazakh elder and they're smoking a peace pipe. And so for 2 years, you have this incredible public movement, and they rally, they protest. Importantly, they are able to bring international partners to their fight. They have people coming from the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, Russia, for the, more formal congresses, but also peace walks and rallies and so forth. And again, this is only one part of the fight, because that fight for the closure of Semipolitinsk polygon was happening at several levels, at the level of the local Semipolitinsk level, at the level of the Republic from Almaty to Moscow, and this more public popular movement. And I think in Kazakhstan, the story is a little bit simplified, right? We only hear about the end of it. What we hear is that the president of Kazakhstan signed a decree on August 29th of 1991 to shut it down. But there is much more behind that story. Obviously, it's very interesting, for example, to observe the change in rhetoric from Almaty to Moscow, because we should remember that it's still the Soviet Union. Kazakh, top leadership is still appointed by Moscow, dependent on Moscow, and so on. And so initially, the letters would be, Kazakhstan fulfilled its patriotic duty, please reduce the number of tests, please reduce the yield. Then it kind of started, consider moving it to another part of the Soviet Union, because we've done our part. And of course, the fact that there was this huge anti-nuclear movement was helping with this narrative. And that's why the government also, not only allowed the movement, but I'm sure also there was what can be called administrative resource, right? Whenever rallies would happen and so on. So all these different parts of Kazakhstan were working together for the common goal. But, for Kazakh officials, they could say, look, our people are protesting and so on. And then towards the end, the tone changes, and basically Nazarbayev and the others, they're just writing, that's it, shut it down. It becomes very forceful. And then also another component of the story that we should not forget is that August 29th, right, when the decree was signed, August 19th to 21st is when the attempted coup against Gorbachev happens. So there is also this kind of mass going on in Moscow, right? And so it all comes together, and Kazakhstan is able to shut down the polygon in 1991, just a few months before the Soviet Union collapses. I really like this photo. It's a artist from Kazakhstan who paints a rendition of Scream at the former nuclear testing site in Semipolitinsk. I like it because it represents the continued legacy of the tests. And And that's something that I can see with my own eyes. This is a photo from one of my trips to the villages near the site. And if just on this photo, this is just one family. And one of their daughters died at the age of 6. The older daughter on the photo, she had facial bone cancer. The little one, if you look closer, she doesn't have 4 fingers on one of her hands. And we visited this family right after visiting another family where a baby of 6 months had more fingers than needed. He had 6. And again, you know, I'm not a doctor, and I'm like for scientific reasons, right? The correlation should be proven without any doubt, which I think is very difficult to do. You know, there are obviously other environmental factors, but I can only talk about my own experience. And my own experience is that you go to those areas and there are hardly any old people. It's very hard to find aksakals. Many people don't live even to the retirement age. There are many children who are not well, and not to mention adults. And here, you know, because I'm speaking to my own people, right, to people of Kazakhstan, I really want to bring up our own responsibility as a society and the responsibility of our government to help. These are the photos I took myself from my field trips from the areas next to the testing site. You know, and of course, I know life in all rural areas in Kazakhstan is difficult, but it hurts me especially because, you know, in the areas next to the former testing site, people are not only dealing with the all kind of problems that we have, right? But they have the additional burden of carrying the health consequences from the Soviet nuclear test. And so for me, it's always very important to remind ourselves, I think, that we deservedly, Kazakhstan deservedly has such a good reputation in the foreign arena, and we really did all the right things in the nuclear field, and I'll explain in the remaining time. But I just wanted to kind of make a point that they really need help. The law on assistance of victims is from 1992, completely out of date. The benefits exist, but they are not adequate. And if anybody's interested, I'm happy to expand on this more, but I just wanted to, it's my duty to say what I think we as Kazakhstan should do. So now moving on to what happened after the collapse. And so the Soviet Union collapses, and there are more than 1,000 nuclear warheads, more than 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles, also heavy bombers that could carry nuclear bombs. And the question is, you know, what to do with the weapons, right? And maybe there was some existential value that, you know, in security studies, it is considered that if you have nuclear weapons, you are treated more seriously. But here, an important technical reminder: Kazakhstan did not have access to command and control of the weapons themselves. They could not launch them. They could not prevent their launch. And so that existential value was it was kind of questionable. And there were so many reasons for why not to keep. First, no value as a military tool. Why? Because they were strategic, right? And the kind of security vulnerabilities that Kazakhstan faced were more regional. And so strategic weapons, not to mention that we couldn't control them, Kazakhstan couldn't control them, they were also the ones designed for strategic purposes. Kazakhstan would immediately become an enemy in the eyes of the neighbors and a target in the eyes of nuclear weapon states. Also, you know, all the facilities and sites with weapons were controlled, you know, from Moscow, and trying to get physical control would mean direct conflict with Russia, and it's obviously not what Kazakhstan needed at the time or ever. And it would mean that if Kazakhstan would have tried to keep the weapons, it would mean that Kazakhstan would be contributing to proliferation. And most importantly, I think there was this very strong normative component that Kazakhstan didn't want to become a pariah state. It wanted to be a responsible one. But also there were all these practical considerations. So Kazakhstan of 1991, for those who maybe were not born back then, it was a very difficult time. I remember it very well. And so, you know, complete economic crisis, no money, no currency. At the same time, natural resources in our ground, right? But somebody had to help to get them out. And for that, Kazakhstan needed foreign investment. It needed technology. It needed access to markets. It also needed access to international institutions. And for the first time, Kazakhstan had a chance to represent itself directly to the outside world. And for all of those reasons, nuclear weapons or attempts to push its way into a nuclear club would really prevent all of this. And I think that this was very strategic and practical calculation of the Kazakh leadership of why nuclear path was not the one that Kazakhstan should pursue. And again, for the audience, I want to remind that while Kazakhstan didn't have access to command and control of weapons themselves, Kazakhstan had full control of nuclear material and many nuclear facilities. So weapons are one story, but it's even more important that Kazakhstan was not interested in everything else that it fully controlled and that could have given it the foundation for its own nuclear program. But of course, Kazakhstan was worried. If you read the transcripts of negotiations and conversations that Kazakh leaders had with the US and others, and also public interviews, again and again, Kazakh leaders would mention that we are concerned about our security. And of course, you know, the documents that are not public interviews, they're even more forceful in driving this point. Very relevant to today and with what's happening in Ukraine. In the early 90s, the Russian nationalists, they would hammer on and on that Kazakhstan is an artificial state. Solzhenitsyn would publish his opuses saying that, you know, artificial borders and so on. With China, the Kazakhstan inherited disputed Soviet China borders, and then, you know, obviously the rest of Central Asia around, everybody was going through a crisis, and so the region was unstable. And that's why in every conversation about denuclearization, Kazakhstan's leadership asked for security guarantees. And in that sense, the important documents that were signed was a bilateral document with the United States, Charter on Democratic Partnership that contained some language on respect for Kazakhstan sovereignty, and then, of course, the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances that we hear so much about now in the context of Ukraine. And so, why it was possible, I think really this is just such a good case of successful diplomacy, both for Kazakhstan, but also for the international community. Because what happened was that Kazakhstan needed certain things from the outside world, and the outside world was able to provide it. Because obviously the international community, especially, the United States, their main objective was to have only one inheritor of Soviet nuclear weapons, not four. And so in a way, everybody got what they wanted, but I really want to underscore that I have so much respect of the statesmen of the early 90s of Kazakhstan, and actually working on that period makes me very nostalgic for that period, because I think there was quite a bit of idealism, but also true statesmanship. Unfortunately, almost no women. I hope it changes, but I think just the quality of statesmanship was really high. Whenever I read those transcripts from the early 90s, I really felt proud. I think that was a really good period for Kazakhstan's diplomacy and also for the foundation of Kazakhstan's sovereignty. And the removal, happened by mid 90s. And, for decades afterwards, there were projects to secure nuclear material, remove nuclear material, destroy missile silos and where these missiles sat. And I just wanted to end my presentation. This is the final slide on a hopeful note. As I said, the legacy of Soviet nuclear tests continues, but I really think that it's so important that Kazakhstan is trying to kind of turn this page from one that is tragic to one that is more focused on using the same infrastructure for science, peaceful technology, for diplomacy. And here you have a photo from the same, polygon, but here now you have international teams working on field exercises, calibrating equipment that can be used in support of future global ban on nuclear tests. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for an absolutely fantastic and really.
Ricardo, sorry, your voice is disrupted.
When I have problems with the microphone, yeah. Dina, it's your turn.
Hello, Togzhan. Nice to see you. Long time no see. So I have a question to you. So very often Kazakhstan is portrayed as an actor that refused from nuclear weapon on its own will. But don't you think that at that time in the 90s, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of pressure on Kazakhstan to get rid of this nuclear weapon? So to what extent Kazakhstan did have the choice to leave or to keep or not to keep this weapon? So this is my first question. And second one is, in your view, because you write about Kazakhstan that got rid of the nuclear weapon, but also Ukraine, right? Ukraine also had to get rid of it. So to what extent Kazakhstan also is unique compared to Ukraine in terms of that? Thank you.
Thank you, Dina, and good to see you after all these years. So whether Kazakhstan refused on its own will, of course, there was so much pressure. Of course, the the entire diplomatic effort was focused on that. But I don't want to deny Kazakhstan its agency. If I sometimes myself would say it was the only and the right choice, right? And Kazakhstan would be isolated if it would try to do anything, and technologically and politically it would be almost a suicide. But having said this, I really think there was also quite a bit of agency that Kazakhstan leaders had, and the fact that it took 2 years, 2 years exactly, from the collapse to Kazakhstan finally formally signing the nuclear non-proliferation treaty as a non-nuclear weapon states, and all those negotiations were, that had to occur, shows that, while definitely there was all this pressure and all this motivation, but it's not that Kazakhstan could be told, you do this and you do this tomorrow. So there was pressure, but also there was agency from the part of Kazakhstan. As for Ukraine, so I would say that Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, they stand in the category of their own. For example, they are definitely not equivalent to South Africa, that as a country developed nuclear weapons and then as a country gave them up. So they're a bit different because their weapons were on their territory and they obviously participated in their creation. Sometimes maybe not, it wasn't their decision, but it's a different case. So there are more similarities between Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine than with anybody else. But between them, and especially Kazakhstan and Ukraine, are not the same cases. There are many parallels in terms of how they fought for the best they could, get in return. They're similar in a way in terms of their security concerns, but there were also important differences. First of all, technologically, Ukraine was in a much more advanced position. It had a missile construction facility, for example. Another important factor, ethnic Kazakhs, there were maybe there were a handful, but there were pretty much no ethnic Kazakhs serving in Soviet strategic forces. The question is also why, right? And I think we know the answer. It's very different from Ukrainians because there were many Ukrainians serving in strategic forces, so they had more expertise in that sense. And so some similarities, some differences.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Togzhan.
There is a question in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tagos, thank you so much for your question. And so, if we're speaking about fairness and justice, of course, I would say that you would expect Russia to do at least something, right? But I'll explain why I don't have any hope about that and why I think by now we better focus on it ourselves. So unfortunately, for everything that is positive in terms of Soviet inheritance, like taking the UN seat, Russia considers itself a direct inheritor. For everything that is not so great, it says, it was the Soviet Union, a country that doesn't exist. Why I think it's pretty much impossible to get any reparations from Russia. I saw in the archives that even requests for some information on, for example, on the fallout, or, please give us the medical records of the civilians. We want to understand better what happened to our people. Nothing. So if something that is relatively, less fundamental that Kazakhstan couldn't get, I think there is truly no hope. And I think, speaking about geopolitics, I don't think official Kazakhstan would ever press this issue too much. And I kind of, that's why, for example, I'm a scholar and I have a full liberty and I say what I think, but we live where we live. Our geopolitics is complicated, and I think we cannot that's not something that is doable in the foreseeable future, and that doesn't remove responsibility from us. It really pains me both as a society and as you know, speaking as for the government. So if you talk to people from that region, they would say, we go to the Ministry of Social Protection, and they say, you know, they dismiss us, they treat us as though we're always begging for something. They don't understand what we lived through. We constantly feel as though we have to ask for things. They obviously also know about all this dismissive attitudes, right? That, oh, you know, Polygonovsky, those people from the Polygon area, they're all sick. And I think so a lot has to be done, you know, at the educational level. How many schools or how many universities talk about these issues? But at the government level, and I'm glad, Podagos, you asked it, we're not a poor country, right? And we somehow have money for export. We also have money for very nice international conferences in Astana on how good we are on the international nuclear politics front, and we are, and I'm so proud. But I think there is a lot that has also to be done internally. And this is where I think, you know, and because I'm Kazakh, I guess I can say it, but it's almost as though we care more about what people outside think of us instead of also doing what is right at home. And so this is where I stand. At this moment, I care more about the people, and because maybe I don't see any practical ways of getting help from Russia, I think we should do it. And for anybody who is interested, there is now a new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons with important provisions on assistance for victims of nuclear tests. And again, Kazakhstan is doing a good job. Our diplomats are really pushing hard on this, and there might be also some movement in terms of international assistance and international recognition of the price that the victims of nuclear tests paid. Again, thank you, Bodagos, for your question.
Johnny back.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kassenova, for this wonderful and very fascinating book. And you are absolutely right in saying that it's not an IR book, because when I thought the book coming, I thought, okay, there is another. I have IR background, and I thought, okay, we're gonna see more kind of IR discussion type. And when I started reading the first chapter, I realized that it's book about the people rather than about IR. The people, the victims of this polygon, the people, the experts who fought against this in the 50s, 60s, doctors, physicists, and others putting their lives and freedoms at risk, and the people who run these rallies in the 80s, and the people who participated in decision making. Mm-hmm. So, and the book makes me also proud in terms of the diplomatic effort that our government put back in the 1990s, right? Because a new country with almost no resources. One example that with nothing, yeah, with no diplomatic kind of stuff, with no independence history, let's say, diplomatic affairs. And one example from the book is very kind of fascinating and illustrative. When the government didn't have any hard currency to pay the President Nazarbayev's first visit to the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, the government, the state, which had no resources to pay the official state visit, right? Mm-hmm. So, and in that sense, I guess it's a kind of very interesting. And I had many questions, and then it's also a book about the agency of a young and independent country, and then much effort that our diplomats back then put. So I just choose two questions from one. What is the role of Russia? Because the book discussed a lot about the Kazakhstani and the US kind of relationship and negotiations. And I was kind of curious, what was Russia's role? Was Russia that busy with its internal kind of thing? So what was the stance? I mean, we know that just kind of general kind of narrative about Russia, but if you have more details. The second thing is more about the kind of, not related to the book, but now we have a lot of discussions in the country about nuclear power plants, right? So how do you see the future of this kind of project in Kazakhstan? So given this kind of public pushback again. So thank you very much again for this wonderful book.
Thank you so much, Janibek, and thank you for already reading the book and for extending this invitation. So on the negotiations, in terms of the negotiations on the fate of nuclear weapons, it was truly more between the United States and Kazakhstan. But of course, United States and Russia, they were pursuing the same goal. It's just that the diplomatic effort was coming from the US, and it was the US that could give Kazakhstan something in return. With Russia, the role of Russia increased a bit later on. For example, when it's more in March 1994 when finally the formal status of nuclear weapons was decided, because until March of 1994, weapons didn't have a clear legal status, and it's only in March 1994 that they were assigned as belonging to Russia. Another important Russia-related bit and that comes in the book is in May of 1992, when Kazakhstan joins the Tashkent Collective Security Treaty. So again, this is where Russia's role was fundamental, because for Kazakhstan, they really needed that feeling that, okay, Russia, we are in the same collective defense mechanism with Russia, so we have to worry about that less. But and then again, Russia's role becomes very important with the cleanup at the Semipolitics testing site, because Kazakhstan knew nothing. Kazakhstan didn't know what was there, what was underground, where containers with nuclear material were stored. And that's where I really credit Russian scientists who were pushing their own government. That the government was reluctant, partly I think because, to open this Pandora box of what they did there and whether they would be then asked for reparations. But Russian scientists really also pushed the government and said, if not us, who? And it's in our interest to remove all of that. And so there the role of Russia becomes important. But that comes in the second half of the book. I think you are more in the first half at the moment, Janibek. On the nuclear power plants, every few years, right, we have this conversation, and this latest round sounded more serious than the previous ones. And when I'm asked for my opinion, I feel that I cannot speak to the necessity of whether we need nuclear power or not, because I'm not a specialist on energy sufficiency and security. But as somebody who works on nuclear issues, I can say that if Kazakhstan decides to go for it, it will need to work really hard to first earn the trust of the public. That is very distressful. Then work really hard on safety and security standards. And I do think that, our more common challenges such as corruption are relevant. The light rail monument to corruption in Astana, right, is a reminder that large-scale projects can fall victims to corruption, and you really don't want to have any improper anything if you're speaking about nuclear power. But now I think I want to add something, new, and that's in the context of what's happening in Ukraine. I think we really, as a country, Kazakhstan should think really hard about what choices it makes in terms of whose reactors it's allowing to build on its territory, who will control them, and so on. So there is a lot of geopolitics that I think has to be considered. It's a serious issue.
If you got a final question.
Hello, Ms. Kassenova, thank you very much. Very interesting and very insightful presentation. I have one question with, let's say, two dimensions. One is the legal dimension and one is the, of course, sociological, political dimension. As per my understanding, no successor state of a recognized nuclear state can have nuclear weapons. And going by that NPT treaty logic, it was legally impossible for any of the successor states of USSR to keep nuclear weapons. That is my one question. What do you have to say about it? Mm-hmm. And the same question, but the other political dimension of it is that why is it that we don't see such a pride and such kind of pride, I would use the word, Kazakhstan expresses by giving up nuclear weapons, while we don't see such political pride in Belarus or in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Oh, I love this this final question. So on the first one, so the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, established in 1968, recognized only 5 countries as nuclear weapon states. One of them was USSR. All the other countries could join the treaty as non-nuclear weapon states, right? So Kazakhstan could only join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon states, but it could also not join it at all. India and Pakistan, for example, are not members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So legally, they're not under obligation of the treaty because they didn't sign it. And so you're correct in saying that they wouldn't be able to join the treaty as a nuclear weapon state, even though there were some, I'll just tell you a nuance. So basically, the treaty language says that only the countries that tested nuclear weapons on their territory can be recognized as nuclear weapon states, who tested until 1968. And at one point, Kazakhstan was even floating. It was a little bit of a bluff, political bluff, but they were saying, oh, look, on our territory, actually, tests occurred, so we can be considered a nuclear state. But of course, legally speaking, it wasn't possible. So it couldn't join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a nuclear weapon state, but it could also not just join it. So there was, theoretically that window. In terms of pride, with Belarus, I think Belarus had the list, and it was this very easy case, very quick. There was not, it was different from Kazakhstan and Ukraine. So Ukraine was the hardest, Kazakhstan, and then Belarus. So I think for Belarus, it was less of an issue and less of a, big component. In Ukraine, unlike in Kazakhstan, there were prominent political groups that were against giving up nuclear inheritance. And that's the difference. So in Kazakhstan, you did have some voices, but they were not powerful. And the decision-making was so centralized. It was always about Nazarbayev and a few advisors, so who were from very early on for a non-nuclear path. So in Ukraine, the pattern was different. It was a more complicated political environment, and it wasn't as straightforward as in Kazakhstan's case. So I think maybe that's partly why, and especially now, starting from 2014, but also now, you can see on social media how much this discourse again raised to the top in terms of, did Ukraine did the right thing? I think in Kazakhstan, it was also partly a personalized narrative that, a lot was invested into using the nuclear story as part of Nazarbayev's personal achievement, diplomacy, foreign policy. And a lot was invested into conveying it to the outside world. And so I think, there is also partly that why Kazakhstan invested so much into that. But I actually think, I think I'm against simplified, personalized narratives, but I fully support that Kazakhstan should be proud of it. And I think, you know, and when I'm asked, oh, is it only this or that, or is it all sincere? And I would say, yes, of course, there is this component of, you know, promoting the successes of the first president, but also fundamentally, it's a very sincere sentiment on behalf of the nation. Like, I truly don't see many people in Kazakhstan who would want nuclear weapons. You know, some, again, of course, I also get some comments on Twitter, but just in general, I think the fact that Kazakhstan suffered so much from nuclear weapons, I think we are all on the same page, and as a society. And so I would say that whatever Kazakhstan is doing on the international front and really being a leader and so constructive, it goes beyond just the first president. It's really fits into the state identity, I would say.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kassenova. Thank you all to all the participants for coming. Thank you to Johnny Beck for organizing this wonderful event. Especially many thanks to Dr. Kassenova for giving a great presentation and for writing an exceptionally good book. We were very happy to have an opportunity to launch our book, and we hope to see you eventually in person on our campus when everything goes fully back to normal. And again, thank you, and thank you everybody, and we see you soon in the other webinars. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.